Welcome to this Tutor to You Sociology topic video looking at global development, focusing on theoretical views of aid. One of the key debates within global development is the extent to which aid is beneficial to the process of development. This debate is often framed around the benefits of aid against the costs accrued as a result of the debt that is placed upon a country when they accept aid from other nations or international governmental agencies, such as the IMF and the World Bank. Critics of aid, such as dependency theorists, see aid as a way in which Western nations can control the developing world, particularly with the application of structural adjustment policies. Other critics of aid, such as neoliberals, argue aid is a form of welfare dependency, discouraging innovation and developing reliance upon the West to sort out economic underperformance of nations. The counter-argument in the aid debate comes from modernisation theorists, who argue that under the right conditions, aid can work and has the ability to facilitate economic growth. Now we can simplify these debates into the three competing positions. Firstly, the modernisation view, which suggests that the purpose of aid is to make targeted interventions that enable nations to move through Rostow's stages of development. In contrast, the Marxist view, referred to as dependency theory, argues that aid is a form of neo-colonialism, one that enables transnational corporations and powerful institutions to continue to exploit the developing world. In contrast to these two approaches, neoliberals argue that aid is a form of welfare dependency, with the developing world leaning on the more affluent nations in order to make ends meet. However, they also utilise aid to promote trade liberalisation or free trade policies through structural adjustment policies, which are conditions placed upon borrowing. These are theoretically used to develop trade and end reliance upon aid. Modernisation theorists favour the use of aid, particularly as Sachs argues, when it is practical, targeted, science-based and measurable. Examples of such programmes are usually found in aid given for healthcare, with immunisation programmes having great success in lowering levels of infant mortality and increasing life expectancy. These types of programmes utilise Western medical expertise and are often rolled out in association with non-governmental organisations such as the Red Cross to great effect. Furthermore, educational outcomes have increased with the implementation of aid, albeit based upon Western curricula and delivered by Western TNCs. In contrast, dependency theorists such as Andre Gunder-Frank argue that aid creates the conditions for Western nations, and in particular TNCs, to continue their exploitation of the developing world. Frank argues that whilst slavery and colonialism are no longer visible in the developing world, their impacts remain. The new colonial rulers are the TNCs, and they use the shackles of debt to keep those in the developing world under their economic control. Hayter further argued that aid was a form of imperialism, as it imposed the values of donor nations upon the population of those nations that received it. Whilst critics would argue that developing Western values of individualism and entrepreneurship may help innovation and economic growth, the use of aid to determine political allegiances is worrying. Aid is often used as a reward for compliance with Western foreign policy. It is also often withdrawn or denied as a sanction for disobedience with these ideologies. For example, during the African famines of the early 1980s, aid was denied to nations such as Ethiopia by Western nations, as the Ethiopian government was sympathetic with the ideals of communism. Dependency theorists argued that aid that is given, particularly multilateral aid administered by agencies such as the IMF and the World Bank, is given with strings attached. These structural adjustment policies are conditions attached to aid and include the liberalisation of trade, allowing large TNCs to trade inside nations. Furthermore, conditions such as the privatisation of state services are encouraged, allowing TNCs to vie for lucrative contracts in education, defence, healthcare and infrastructure development. The arrival of TNCs often results in indigenous companies being unable to compete with the economies of scale that global giants can obtain, and thus drives out any realistic chance of competition from homegrown enterprise. This expansion of capitalism, according to dependency theorists, stifles competition and leaves developing nations dependent upon overseas investment for most of their services. Neoliberals on the surface criticise the use of aid as they argue that it leads to a form of welfare dependency. They argue that aid is often given to corrupt governments and that Western nations are unable to account for where and how it is spent. They further argue that this debt is left upon the people of those nations, and this discourages the development of an entrepreneurial spirit and innovation that will help lead these nations to become self-sufficient. In theory, they favour the use of trade in development. However, they will use aid in order to further the liberalisation of trade, particularly with nations that are rich in natural resources. Neoliberals such as Ericsson argue that despite receiving billions in aid, many developing nations are actually poorer than they were at the point of their political independence from colonial masters. Furthermore, economist Dumbrisa Moyo argues that aid is often given to ease the Western conscience. She highlights humanitarian causes by musicians, such as Live Aid, as being one way in which the West deals with the debt crisis, or aid, without offering real practical solutions to the issues facing the developing world. Furthermore, Moyo argues that donor nations should be more accountable when measuring the value of aid given to the developing world. She argues that much aid is lost, misspent, or spent inefficiently, and generates further costs to the developing world. In evaluating the aid debate, it's important to consider the long-term versus short-term impacts on the developing world of receiving aid. Collier argues that aid rarely provides more than short-term respite from the far-reaching problems of developing nations. He argues that much aid is lost to bad governance and that conflicts in the developing world are an unsustainable cost to the process of development. Sachs, however, argues that aid has worked, particularly when examining rates of infant mortality and the increase in life expectancy of individuals in the developing world, but that this aid was practical, targeted and science-based. Finally, it can be argued that aid is often poorly administered by those in the West, particularly the IMF and the World Bank. Hancock described these agencies of development as the lords of poverty, who lend money and impose exploitative policies which enable Western TNCs to profit from nations with plentiful labour, natural resources and weak legislation against capitalism. That concludes this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on global development, focusing on theoretical views of aid. Thanks for watching.